Hey, I see you there, little vibe coder, thinking you're real slick coding away. This is me too. If you made it here, you're probably doing a little bit of vibe coding and you're wondering, is my code any good? What's wrong with it? What do I need to know to make it better? For a little bit of context, about 2 weeks ago, I started designing with data. So I opened up Cursor, opened up our code base, started trying to produce a new feature with vibe coding. Now, luckily for me, I have a benefit that you might not have, which is a software engineer with about 20 years experience. We've built software together and now we're building another one, and he has a hell of a lot of experience and he knows what good code looks like. So basically what we did was we put the two head to head. I built the feature and I gave him screenshots, and then he went and built the feature. And then after he merged it into main, I asked AI to analyze the code between the two, looking for a few things that typically represent better code, things that are more stable, last longer, and are better for the business and for the health of the code overall for how you want to extend it later. So the overall assessment, it doesn't look too bad. Main branch score 92%, R&D branch score 68%. I'll get to at the end why I think even this score is very generous, and maybe AI just like inflating its own ego a little bit. First up, we've got component files. While I was building this, I was asking the code constantly to use existing components. If you're trying to extend on an existing code base, you would really hope that it would search for and reuse components, but I don't think it wants to use its resources to go and look really hard. What you need to be doing at the moment anyway is going and finding the component you wanted to use and referencing it. It'll do that. End result of that was 21 plus component files versus 9 or 10 in the main branch. So that's 52% fewer files in main branch when it's been coded properly. Total line of codes is a lot worse. It's 4,000 lines approx versus 900 lines. And it's important to note here that I did a bunch of other things that weren't necessary, like different views and a couple of extensions or things that we might do in the future. However, one of the things that we notice is because it's so easy to create with AI, the problem is that you end up creating way more than you should. And a lot of the time, the value in what gets into the code base is what's edited out of the production. We've always done this anyway. So when I design with Figma, what ends up in development is usually stripped back from that. And you sort of try and get to the ideal state later when it's necessary, once you've got user data, etc. If you don't have like a historical list of everything you're adding and why, when it comes time for it to review and reduce the amount of code, it's not going to know what to reduce and why, because it's not going to know the importance level of everything. So then we've got custom hooks. So created 2 custom hooks versus 1 shared hook. That's a 50% reduction in hooks. Page components, created 2 custom pages on 1 standard page. Once again, that's half the amount of page components. So the main branch ended up achieving exactly the same functionality with significantly less code. And someone with experience is hand building it. They're going to be able to reuse and abstract things in a much cleaner way than the code can. And so looking at the architecture patterns, this is very simple. Post scheduler, week view, index week column, unscheduled post, use week view. Everything has a single responsibility, composition over inheritance, rather than the look of something and the structure of something being informed by something at a higher level. It's all contained within everywhere it needs to be, has its own context. Reusing the hooks and then minimal component nesting. So I think this is a product of me trying to get it to be clean, like clean code. It's ended up going way too deep. It never hits back at you and says like, oh, you're actually going too many levels deep here, so I'm going to keep them separate. Because if you ask it, can you promote this to a higher order component that controls more things? It's going to say, yes, I can do that. Not going to necessarily tell you that that's not a good idea in this case because you're going too many levels deep with context. And then we have the R&D branch. So post scheduler, index, column, day section, day drop zone. These ones are the ones where it went into different views. Because I was asking for that, I asked it to do the different views. Everything that I've done here made it more complex and less clear to the user how to use the product. And then the use post schedule scheduler. I've tried to tell it to use like really verbose names because we typically use verbose names because they're easier to recognize, but like it's still like it doesn't get it right. Naming things like this is so important so that the code understands what it's doing. So too many abstraction layers, it's going too deep and it's promoting things up too high. This means that people who want to edit stuff has to look through 4 different files and go and update those 4 different files. If you're doing something at the base level and you want something up at the top level to come down, you want to pass the prof down. So that's not ideal to have that many files open. And then just overly complex state management. So keeping multiple view modes in the one component tree, just a bad idea in general. And then we go into state management. So this is what is responsible for understanding what it has to show. In the main branch, we've got the week view payload, which is using week view, and it takes in the organization, post, weeks ahead, weeks behind, and the state's living in a custom hook where the component is just doing presentation work. It's not trying to do anything else, not trying to do business logic. Custom hook encapsulates the state logic, and it's props driven, so it doesn't have internal state in the presentational component. It's a single source of truth, and it's easy to test and think about when you look at it. You can see in the code that this is what it's doing. The R&D branch, here we go. You can see what a freaking disaster this ended up being. We've got 4 state variables in a single component. Terrible idea. State being scattered across multiple components. So then you're going to have hydration issues. You're going to have like refreshes, things going wrong. Things being dependent on one another is a really bad idea. It makes things really complex. It makes it hard to troubleshoot. And it's not having centralized state management. If you're experiencing something like this, if you run some sort of analysis and you're like, I'm just having a lot of trouble managing the state, this is one of the things that an AI vibe coded app can do, is ends up not doing this properly. So one thing you might want to do is be prompting for centralized state management across your pages. All right, page structure. So this one, I think it's quite important to mention that I asked it specifically many times to use existing page layouts and do everything it could to use the components that existed in the code base, and it just didn't do it. You can see I don't have the code up here of the exact page, but it was a complete mess. And the thing that this doesn't talk about here is just how broken it was. So when I captured the screenshots, I couldn't work on that page properly. It wasn't set up properly. It wasn't clean. It didn't function like I was expecting. The scrolls are all over the place. Trying to get it to change one thing was really hard because it wasn't really aware of what I was trying to talk about to change it. And that is the result of me building it completely custom, even though I asked it to use things and not having it really clean like this. When I was building it, I was asking it to scroll weeks horizontally, talking in human language, and having a really bad experience of trying to get it to understand what I was talking about, to the point I was asking it to name things in comments, to say like, can you name this so that we both understand what I'm asking you to change. So you can see in the main, we use the page layout, we use the dashboard module, we use the filter bar. These are all already things that exist, following all existing design system structure patterns. And I, even with this one, went as far as like getting Cursor to define a design system structure, and it still didn't listen to it. I pulled all of the components out into a design system section on the site because I thought that might help if I could refer to it, and it still didn't do it properly. On a side note, that part was really useful, getting Cursor to put all the components over here. For me as a designer, being able to go to a page and have all the components that are available with their states, with the colors that are used, the typography that is actually in the system. We have in the past used plenty of tools to try and get code to design to match, and nothing in Figma ever stays quite up to date with exactly what's in the code. Anyway, the main code base, clean separation of conserved, reusable layout components, the R&D branch, 100 lines of state management, custom layout structure, direct on manipulation, and custom styling. And that is with me trying to get it to resemble what was already written in the system, which was written well. It still never ended up using the right components. It was inconsistent, hard to maintain. It was hard for me just to vibe code against it. So I can imagine it would be almost impossible for anyone to jump in and fix things later. Then we're on to code quality. So the average component size in the main branch was about 100 lines. And this isn't something that I specifically knew to target. So I didn't ask Cursor to do this in any particular way, but you can see it's got double the amount of lines in a component, which is going to be a bad thing if you're looking through a component, or if you're passing context to AI for a whole bunch of components. The more lines you're using in a component, the worse it's going to be. And the max next nesting depth, same thing, already spoke about why that can be a problem before. Cyclomatic complexity, which is basically a bunch of math that you can run, like people run it to say, what are the paths that can be taken? And basically every path and every function has a risk of something going wrong. So keeping that number down is a really good thing. And reusability, high for the main branch, low for the R&D branch. I back that up 100%. Type safety, main branch, really good. The types in like AI, I was trying to get good types, but it is really, really a fan of just putting any be anywhere. And I think that's because a lot of people do that in their code. So you have to be really strict with it. And even then, it's too complex. Like these types weren't done in a good way. Before I go into those performance considerations, I just want to point out that when I was showing Ken the designs, it was writing n+1 queries everywhere, which is really bad because the system was polling to check for updates, which is something we did in the Kanban. So I can't fault AI for doing that in the post scheduler. It had done absolutely no caching. It was using Ruby to aggregate, not the DB. So it wasn't doing anything in SQL. There was a single controller method, had over 550 lines. It was using JSON-B for critical data. It was missing indexes. And I did a lot of work to fix that. So we ended up with this component tree depth way too high, and the impact being the render times way slower because it has to go through the component tree. State update, the number of render cycles was 60% more render cycles, and then code splitting, everything was worse in mine. So I had a much larger initial bundle size, like the actual code base size was astronomically larger. Then query optimization, like I said, it wasn't doing any of this properly. This is after I tried to fix it, but it says both branches use similar query patterns: eager loading, policy scoping, database level filtering, maintainability, simple components, easy to test, clear separation of concerns, minimal dependencies, and predictable behavior in the main branch. Complex state interactions, too many dependencies, really hard to mock data into an unpredictable side effect. Basically, the idea of me doing this is I want to be able to look for these things next time. Code reusability, components can be reused, hooks are shareable, follows existing patterns, easy to extend. My ones were tighter couples, custom implementations, hard to extract logic and not following patterns, not good. Onboarding new developers becomes immediately harder with this, it's not good. Luckily, I went into this knowing that this thing is never going to reach production. This is for visual display only, but I still wanted it to functions, because if you want to design something with code, you want it to function enough that you get the picture of how data will display. You can actually use it and feel it and know what is and isn't important. But if you're pure vibe coding, you want to be aware that this is where you end up. It's a really hard to develop on top of code base. These tools are amazing, but they're still basically like a prototype or a placeholder for actual software development. So then it gets into these final scores, but I think it's important to mention that these final scores, you can't even pull that 68%, because if it was able to go and test the code from a user's side, everything was broken on mine. Everything was cooked and nothing worked exactly as it should. The main branch was beautiful to use from the second it made it to production, because it was coded properly and tested properly and everything. I'd put this score 30% mark, if that. Probably give it less if I had to consider that, what would be the cost long-term of that code in production would be astronomical. So I'd probably do it less than 30%, but these are the key learnings. These are things that you could apply. You could apply all of these things to get a better result from your code, which is to ask the AI to look for simplicity over complexity, pattern adherence, code reusability, maintainability. If you give it those things, it'll know what you mean, and it might do an okay job at improving what you've currently got. But it's definitely no substitute for a real person looking at the code. So there's nothing surprising there. Someone with years and years of experience did a much better job than AI sent by me. Hopefully that helps. If you're trying to build something, there's so many things to look for. And I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep vibe designing because it's a really fluid way of designing the product. I'm going to keep trying to get my code better, closer to something that a senior engineer would write. So if it was interesting to you and you want to see what the next feature looks like, make sure you follow along, hit the subscribe button. If you want to check out clipflow, clipflow is built for project management at scale with a team specifically focused for content. It's available at clipflow.co. Peace.